Get comfortable. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. Let your jaw unclench. And let me tell you about the night the world ended. Well, not the world. A world. 3,200 years ago, there was a civilization stretched around the eastern Mediterranean that was richer, more connected, and more sophisticated than anything that would exist again for 1,000 years afterward. And then, in this space of about 50 years, almost all of it simply stopped. Cities burned, kingdoms vanished, writing itself was forgotten. Tonight, we're going to walk through that collapse slowly, carefully, from the golden age to the silence. And I promise you, it is a much stranger story than barbarians showed up. Let's start with when. The late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 BC. Egypt is in its new kingdom, the age of Ramesses and Tutankhamun. In Anatolia, modern Turkey, the Hittite Empire rules from a mountain capital called Hattusa. On mainland Greece, the Mycenaeans, the people Homer would later turn into the heroes of Troy, sit in stone citadels with walls so thick that later Greeks assumed giants had built them. On the Syrian coast, the merchant kingdom of Ugarit. On Cyprus, a copper island the Egyptians called Al-Ashia. And in Mesopotamia, Assyria and Babylon. 7 or 8 great powers, all at the same time, all talking to each other.
And that last part is the part people underestimate. These weren't isolated kingdoms occasionally bumping into each other. This was a system. Egyptian gold went north, Cypriot copper went everywhere, Mycenaean pottery turns up in Egyptian tombs, Baltic amber from the North Sea has been found in Greek graves. Ivory from Africa was carved by craftsmen in Syria into furniture for kings in Anatolia. A wealthy person in Ugarit could own objects from 4 continents. If you want a modern word for it, the honest one is globalization. And I don't use that word to be dramatic. The archaeology simply looks like that.
Here's the thing that made it all possible, and also the thing that would kill it. Bronze. The entire age is named after an alloy. And an alloy is a recipe, roughly 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. Copper was manageable. Cyprus had mountains of it. Tin was the problem. There is almost no tin in the eastern Mediterranean. To make bronze, to make every sword, every plow blade, every cauldron, every chisel that cut the stones of these palaces, you needed a metal that had to travel thousands of miles overland from somewhere else entirely. Every kingdom in this story was, in the most literal sense, dependent on a supply chain.
We know exactly how far that tin traveled because a ship sank. We'll get to her properly later. She's one of the great characters in this story. But here's the headline. In 1982, a sponge diver off the southern coast of Turkey mentioned to an archaeologist that he had seen, and I love this phrasing, metal biscuits with ears on the seabed. Those biscuits were copper ingots. The wreck they came from was carrying 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin. And when modern scientists finally traced the chemistry of that tin, a third of it came from ore deposits in what is now Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, 3,000 kilometers away.
Sit with that for a second, because it's the whole story in one image. A merchant ship sinking off Turkey in roughly 1320 BC with metal in her hold that had been dug out of the ground near the border of modern Afghanistan, carried by hand and donkey and boat across mountains and deserts and seas, passing through the hands of who knows how many traders to end up as raw material for a sword in the Aegean. That is not a primitive world. That is a world with logistics. And the deep, quiet lesson of the next hour is that logistics are load-bearing. Take them away, and everything above them comes down. Quick note on the date in the title, because it's a slightly cheeky one, and I'd rather you know. 1177 BC comes from Eric Klein, whose book on this period made the date famous. It's the 8th year of Ramesses III, the year of that great battle against the Sea Peoples recorded at Medinet Habu. Klein chose it the way 1945 is chosen for the end of the Second World War. Not because everything happened in that one year, but because it's a real, dated, documented moment you can hang a story on. The collapse itself took about 50 years. 1177 is the pin in the map. One more thing before we go further, because I want you to be able to picture these people rather than think of them as background extras. They wrote.
Constantly. There were letters, inventories, tax records, ration lists, complaints, prayers, recipes, medical texts, and, my personal favorite category, passive-aggressive diplomatic correspondence between kings who were pretending to like each other. Tens of thousands of clay tablets survive, and they survive precisely because so many of these cities burned. Fire destroys paper. Fire bakes clay. Almost everything we know about the end of this world was preserved by the disaster that ended it. Do not mind me, sleepwalking straight to the one thing that matters, right down there. So let's read some of that mail. In 1887, an Egyptian woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of a city called Amarna found clay tablets. Not Egyptian hieroglyphs. Cuneiform, the wedge writing of Mesopotamia. What she had stumbled into was the Foreign Ministry archive of the Pharaoh Akhenaten. Around 350 tablets, and they are, without exaggeration, the most human documents to survive from the ancient world, because they are the private letters of great kings. And great kings turn out to be exactly as petty as everyone else. Here is the first thing you notice. They call each other brother. The king of Babylon writes to the Pharaoh of Egypt and opens with "my brother." The Hittite king does the same, so does the king of Assyria and of Mitanni and of Cyprus. Historians call this group the Club of Great Powers, and it is generally considered the first documented international society in human history. A small set of rulers who agreed, more or less, that they were peers. Not a United Nations. More like a very exclusive and very touchy family where everyone is technically equal and everyone is quietly keeping score. And what did brothers do? They exchanged gifts: gold, textiles, furniture, horses, lapis lazuli, exotic animals. And crucially, this is the part that makes the whole system make sense, the gifts were not optional. They were the obligation. Gift-giving was the mechanism of the relationship. Sending gold to Babylon wasn't generosity, it was maintenance. It kept the trade routes open, kept the marriage alliances alive, kept your brother from deciding he was actually your rival. The late Bronze Age ran on a kind of ceremonial reciprocity that we would recognize instantly if we saw it in a family at Christmas. Which naturally means the letters are full of complaints about the gifts. Genuinely, a substantial portion of the correspondence between the most powerful men on Earth consists of grumbling that the presents were stingy, that an envoy wasn't treated with proper courtesy, or that a brother who had fallen ill never received a get-well message. Kings write long, wounded paragraphs about being underappreciated. If you have ever received a birthday present that felt like it was bought at a petrol station on the way over, you are having a late Bronze Age emotional experience. The gold, by the way, had a job. Deliveries of Egyptian gold were tied to interdynastic marriages. A Babylonian or Mitanni princess would go to Egypt, and gold would flow back the other way. All of it wrapped in the language of brotherhood, friendship, and love between great kings. Political scientists have looked at this and pointed out something interesting. These rulers justified their obligations not through anything like national interest, but through kinship and friendship. The system was held together by relationships, which is lovely. It is also structurally quite fragile. Let me give you the texture of it. In one exchange, a king complains that the gold he received was of poor quality, that when it was put in the furnace, far less came out than was promised. In another, a ruler is offended that his messengers were detained for years. In another, a smaller king writes desperately asking for troops and gets, in effect, a polite nothing. Read enough of them, and a picture forms of a world with real institutions, envoys, treaties, protocols, expectations, and no real enforcement. Everything ran on the assumption that everyone would keep showing up. And for 200 years, they did keep showing up. That's the thing to hold on to as we move into the darker half of the story. This wasn't a fragile, doomed little world that was always about to fall over. It worked. It worked for longer than the United States has existed. Generations of people were born, lived, and died inside a stable international order and had every reason to believe their grandchildren would too. Nobody in Ugarit in 1250 BC was walking around thinking, well, this can't last. It felt permanent. Systems always feel permanent from the inside. Now,
Let's go back to that shipwreck, because she deserves a proper introduction. She's called the Ulubu Rune, named after the headland she sank near, off the coast of southern Turkey. She went down around 1320 BC, so about a century and a half before the collapse, at the absolute height of this world. And she is, I think, the single most eloquent object in this entire story, because she is the late Bronze Age caught mid-sentence, a working ship on a working route, doing a completely ordinary job, frozen at the moment she stopped. Her cargo: 10 metric tons of Cypriot copper ingots, 1 metric ton of tin. That is the largest assemblage of raw Bronze Age metal ever found anywhere, and together it was enough to produce roughly 11 tons of the highest quality bronze. 11 tons! That's not a merchant's samples. That's an industrial shipment, enough metal to arm an army or fit out a palace. One ship. And she was not, as far as anyone can tell, exceptional. She was just the one we happened to find, because she happened to sink. And then there's everything else she was carrying, which reads like the inventory of a museum rather than a boat. Glass ingots, raw cobalt blue glass, a luxury material. Unworked elephant tusks, ostrich eggshells, faience beads, resin, ebony, jewelry, weapons, tools, foodstuffs. Objects of Egyptian, Canaanite, Cypriot, Mycenaean, Assyrian, Kassite, Babylonian, and Nubian origin, all in the same hole at the same time. Somebody had assembled that cargo deliberately, and somebody was expecting it at the other end. The crew is where it gets personal. From their personal effects, their weapons, their cooking gear, their little everyday things, archaeologists concluded that the ship was operated by a Syro-Canaanite crew. But there were also passengers aboard from the Greek mainland. So on one small wooden vessel in roughly 1320 BC, you had Levantine sailors carrying Cypriot metal and Central Asian tin and African ivory, with Mycenaean Greeks traveling along. Nobody on that boat would have found that unusual. That was Tuesday. Here's the discovery that changed how we read Urubalum. In 2022, a study in the journal Science Advances put the tin ingots through lead isotope and trace element analysis and traced them to their sources. 2/3 came from the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia. Reasonable, that's local. The remaining third came from ore deposits in modern Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, over 3,000 kilometers away, across the roof of Asia. And the pattern of the metal suggested it hadn't come through one grand imperial pipeline. It came through small-scale exchange, hand to hand to hand, all the way across a continent. Think about what that means. There was no empire spanning that route, no single authority guaranteeing it. It was thousands of individual small transactions, each one made by someone who had no idea and no interest in the far end of the chain, linking a mine in Central Asia to a foundry in Cyprus to a sword in Greece. It worked beautifully. It also had no owner, no manager, and nobody whose job it was to keep it alive. When conditions changed, there was nobody to save it. It just stopped being profitable, link by link, and then it wasn't there anymore. And I want to leave the Uluburun with one image, because it's the one I think about. She sank. Her cargo was worth a genuine fortune, the value of a small town. Somewhere a merchant lost everything. Somewhere a palace never got its copper. Somewhere families waited for a ship that never rounded the headland. And it didn't matter. The system absorbed it. Another ship sailed the next season, and the next, and the century rolled on. And nobody ever wrote her name down. That's how strong the world was in 1320 BC. Losing 11 tons of bronze was survivable. Remember that when we get to what happens when it isn't. So, what went wrong? And I want to be honest with you about something right at the top, because a lot of retellings of this story get it wrong in a way that sounds better than the truth. You will often hear that nobody knows why the Bronze Age collapsed. That's not quite right. We know a great deal about what happened. What's genuinely argued over is how much weight each cause carries and in what order. The mystery isn't an empty space, it's a crowded one. There are too many culprits all in the room at the same time, and that turns out to be the actual answer.
Let's start with the sky, because the sky came first. In a cave in Israel called Sorak, water has been dripping through limestone for a very long time, building stalactites and stalagmites layer by layer. Each layer carries a chemical signature of the rainfall that made it. Read those layers, and you get a rainfall record for the northern Levant going back 150,000 years. And in that record, running through the end of the Bronze Age, scientists found something unmistakable: an unprecedented and steady decline in rainfall continuing all the way down to about 1150 BC. Not a bad summer, not a difficult decade, a multi-generational drying trend. And Sarek isn't alone. Cores drilled from the bed of the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, read in high resolution for both their sediment and their ancient pollen, point to a dramatic drying trend. And Sarek isn't alone. Cores drilled from the bed of the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, read in high resolution for both their sediment and their ancient pollen, point to a dramatic dry event beginning in the later phase of the Late Bronze Age, around the middle of the 13th century BC, and lasting somewhere between 120 and 150 years. Broader pollen and river sediment records suggest a mega drought gripping the region from about 1200 to 850 BC. I want you to translate that from science into life, because a rainfall graph doesn't feel like anything. 150 years of drying means this: a farmer plants where his father planted and gets less. He tells himself it's a bad year. His son plants the same field and gets less again, and thinks his father was a better farmer. His grandson abandons the field entirely and doesn't remember it was ever good. Nobody experiences the drought. Everybody experiences a slightly worse life than the one before for 6 generations. And the memory of how it used to be dies before the drought does. And then there is the sharpest piece of evidence we have, which arrived only 3 years ago, and which is so precise it's slightly uncomfortable. West of Ankara in Turkey, there's a 53-meter-tall man-made burial mound called the Midas Mound at Gordion. Inside it is ancient timber, juniper, preserved for 3,000 years. In 2023, a team from Cornell published a study in the journal Nature. They read the growth rings of that juniper alongside the stable isotopes locked in the wood, which together record not just how much the tree grew, but how thirsty it was while growing. What they found is this: a general shift toward drier conditions from the late 13th century into the 12th, and then sitting inside that trend like a knife, 3 consecutive years of severe drought around 1198 to 1196 BC, give or take 3 years. 3 years in a row, in a region already stressed, already drying, already running thin. And that date, 1198 to 1196, lines up almost exactly with the moment the Hittite Empire disappears from history. A tree in a burial mound remembered the year an empire ran out of food. Now, a note of caution, because I'd rather be useful than dramatic. The researchers themselves are careful here. Drought did not by itself destroy the Hittite Empire, or anyone else. What they suggest is that it may have sharply worsened political, economic, and social problems. That were already there. Think of it as the difference between the illness and the thing that kills the patient. A healthy state survives 3 dry years. A state already carrying debt, unrest, overstretched supply lines, and a nervous army does not. Drought was the accelerant. It wasn't the fire. Which brings us to Hattusa, up on the Anatolian plateau at around 1,000 meters, ringed by stone walls that run for kilometers over rock outcrops, sat the capital of the Hittite Empire, one of the 3 or 4 genuine superpowers of the age. The Hittites had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh and then signed the world's oldest surviving peace treaty with them. They had chariots, ironworking, a legal code, a vast archive, and they had one enormous structural problem, which was that their heartland was a high, cold, dry plateau that could not reliably feed them. So they imported. Grain came in by sea and road, and crucially, a great deal of it came from Egypt. The last Hittite kings were, in a very real sense, running an empire on someone else's harvest. And that arrangement is fine, right up until the harvest fails everywhere at once, which is exactly what a region-wide drought does.
Egypt has the Nile, which we'll come back to, so Egypt suffers less, but Egypt suffering less is not the same as Egypt having surplus to spare. And when the surplus goes, the first thing that stops moving is the food you are sending to somebody else.
To understand how big a deal the Hittites were, here's one fact. Around 1274 BC, they fought Egypt at a place called Kadesh in what is now Syria. Possibly the largest chariot battle ever fought, with something like 5,000 or 6,000 chariots on the field. Ramesses II went home and carved victory inscriptions all over Egypt. The Hittites also recorded a victory. Both sides claimed it, which usually means neither got one. And then, about 15 years later, they did something remarkable. They signed a peace treaty. Copies survive from both sides. It is the oldest surviving international peace treaty in the world, and a reproduction of it hangs at the United Nations. We can hear them running out. In the archives of Hattusa, scribes recorded pleas for emergency grain shipments. Tablet fragments unearthed as recently as 2019 show frantic diplomatic missions searching for grain from increasingly distant allies. There's a letter in which a Hittite ruler makes it about as plain as royal correspondence ever gets that this is a matter of life and death. Read across the archive and you can watch the tone change over years, from routine requisitions to urgent requests to something that sounds a lot like begging from the most powerful court in Anatolia. The last king we know of is Suppiluliuma II. He came to the throne around 1207 BC. He is, almost certainly, the man who watched the kingdom of Hatti end. And we do not know what happened to him. There is no account of his death, no successor, no conquest inscription from an enemy boasting about defeating him. The record of one of the great empires of the ancient world simply stops mid-sentence, and the silence afterward is total. For a civilization that wrote down everything, that absence is the loudest thing in the archive. And then there's the detail about Hattusa itself, which is the strangest and most haunting thing in this entire chapter. Around 1190 BC, the city falls silent, but not apparently by violence first. The evidence suggests the capital was deliberately emptied by its own royal administration. The archives were methodically buried. Valuables were removed. The city was evacuated in an orderly way. Only afterwards was it burned. That is not a sack. That is a decision. Somebody stood in that palace and gave the order to leave and had the presence of mind to save the records on the way out. We don't know where they went. We don't know if it was famine or an enemy or a slow decision taken over years as the population drained away and holding the place stopped making sense. What we know is that Hattusa was never an imperial capital again, and that the Hittite Empire never reformed in Anatolia. A few splinter kingdoms carried the name southward for a while, smaller, poorer, provincial, but the empire that had fought Egypt to a draw was gone, and the mountain city that ruled it went back to being a mountain. Now we go down to the coast, to a city called Ugarit on the shore of what is now northern Syria. If Hattusa was the fortress, Ugarit was the marketplace. It was a merchant kingdom, wealthy, cosmopolitan, plugged into everything. Its people invented one of the earliest alphabets. Its archives are stuffed with contracts, shipping records, tax accounts, and letters in half a dozen languages. If you wanted to understand how the Bronze Age world actually did business, Ugarit is where you would go. And Ugarit is where we get to read a kingdom's final hours in its own handwriting. The last king of Ugarit was called Amurabi. Among the final documents from an archive belonging to a man named Rapanu are 3 letters, and one of them is cataloged today as RS 2238. It is correspondence between Amurabi and a man called Eshuara, the grand supervisor of Al-Ashia, Cyprus, the Copper Island. And in it, Amurabi reports something he has just been told. An enemy fleet has been sighted at sea. 20 ships. Eshuara writes back, and his reply is the detail that turns a document into a scene, because it is so completely, recognizably human. He asks Amurabi where his own forces are, and he asks where exactly the enemy fleet is now. Those are the questions of a man on the other end of a bad phone line, trying to work out how serious this is, and whether he can help. There is no grand rhetoric in it. It's 2 administrators in a crisis trying to establish basic facts. 3,200 years later, that exchange still reads like the last 10 minutes before something terrible And another tablet, written in the city's final days, tells us why the answer was so bad. It describes enemy ships offshore and a military absence. Ugarit's forces were not there. Its army and its fleet had been sent elsewhere on obligations to allies, doing the things that a well-connected member of an international system is supposed to do. The city that had grown rich on being connected to everyone was, at the decisive moment, undefended because it was busy helping everyone else. There is a bitter kind of logic to that, which I don't think needs explaining. We can date the end with unusual precision. The fall of Ugarit is now placed securely between 1196 and 1190 BC, based on reinterpretation of another tablet, RS 862230, alongside Egyptian records of the same upheaval. More recent radiocarbon work narrows the destruction to somewhere between 1192 and 1190 BC, a window of 2 or 3 years, 3,200 years ago. We know when this city died more precisely than we know a lot of medieval history. Neither kingdom made it. Ugarit was destroyed. Alatia on Cyprus, the other voice in that correspondence, the one asking where the fleet was overwhelmed too. The two men writing to each other about 20 ships were both of them near the end of their world and did not know it. And their letters survived because the fire that took the city baked the clay they were written on. That is the ugly gift this collapse gave us. We can read these people so clearly only because of what happened to them. One last thing about Ugarit, and then we'll move. After that fire, the city was never reoccupied. Not rebuilt on a smaller scale, not squatted in, not resettled by farmers a century later. Nothing. In a region where cities are usually rebuilt on their own rubble again and again for thousands of years, which is why they end up as hills, Ugarit was simply abandoned to the wind. Whoever survived did not come back, and the harbor that had connected 3 continents went quiet for good. So, who was in those ships? This is the part of the story everybody has heard some version of, and it is also the part where the popular version is furthest from what the evidence supports. The Sea Peoples. They have a wonderfully ominous name, which is a 19th century invention rather than anything the ancients call them, and they have been blamed for essentially everything that happened in this century. Let's actually look at what we have, which is principally one wall in Egypt. At Medinet Habu, on the west bank at Thebes, stands the mortuary temple of Ramesses III. Its walls are covered with reliefs and texts describing his campaigns, and the most important of them date to the 8th year of his reign, approximately 1190 BC. This is the single richest surviving account of the crisis from anyone who lived through it. And I'm going to read you a piece of it, because the Egyptians described what was happening to the world around them, and their description is genuinely chilling. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Kate, Kode, Karchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peliset, Checker, Shekelish, Danuna, and Weshish, lands united. End quote. Read that again in your head, slowly, and notice what the Egyptians are actually saying. Not that a country was attacked, that the lands were removed. Kate is the Hittites, Alashia is Cyprus, Karchemish, Arzawa, Kode, these are the great names of the northern world. And Egypt's account is that they were cut off at one time. All at once. Whatever else you think about Egyptian propaganda, and there is plenty of it in these inscriptions, that is a contemporary observer telling us the collapse was experienced as simultaneous, not a slow decline, a cascade. Now, the honest part. Who were they? The names in that list, Peliset, Checker, Shekelesh, Danuna, Weshesh, are groups, and we can match some of them to places with reasonable confidence and others barely at all. But the deeper question is not their names, it's their role, because there are 2 very different readings of the Sea Peoples, and Syria scholars hold both. Reading 1, they were the cause, invaders who swept in and destroyed a stable world. Reading 2, they were the symptom, refugees, whole populations with families and carts and livestock, displaced by the same drought and famine and collapse, moving because staying meant starving. And the Egyptian reliefs themselves push toward the second reading in a way that's easy to miss. The carvings don't only show warships, they show ox carts, they show women and children, they show household goods. The great enemy fleet that Ramesses defeats is in the pictures Ramesses himself commissioned to celebrate defeating it, at least partly a migration. People carrying everything they own on the move, because whatever was behind them was worse. Which means the terrifying invaders and the terrified victims may often have been the same people at different points on the same road. We even know now where some of them came from because of DNA. In 2019, a study in Science Advances analyzed ancient genomes from Ashkelon on the coast of what is now Israel, comparing individuals from 3 periods: the Bronze Age, the Early Iron Age, and the Later Iron Age. The Early Iron Age group, the people we call Philistines, one of those sea people names, the Peleset, carried between 25 and 70% of their ancestry from southern European populations. The closest matches were to ancient people from the Aegean, Sardinia, and Iberia. So yes, real people really did move across real distances in this period, and they really did settle on that coast. The migration happened. But here is the ending to that study that I find genuinely moving. Within a couple of generations, that European genetic signal fades. By the 10th and 9th centuries BC, the people still being called Philistines no longer show meaningful European ancestry. 200 years after the migration, the DNA of individuals buried there matches the local Levantine population completely. Intermarriage had simply absorbed them. The great feared invaders became, quietly, the neighbors. And here's what the movement of those people did to the sea itself, which is the part that finally kills the system. You do not need to conquer a trade network to destroy it. You only need to make it unprofitable. If one voyage in 5 ends with your cargo taken and your crew dead, no insurance, no navy, no guarantee, then the rational merchants stop sailing. Not out of fear, out of arithmetic. And once enough merchants stop, the ports stop being worth maintaining, and the harbor officials go home, and the route quietly ceases to exist. The Mediterranean didn't close because someone closed it. It closed because it stopped paying. And that's the honest verdict on the Sea Peoples. They were real, they were destructive, they were also, in large part, victims of the same catastrophe, running ahead of it rather than causing it. Blaming the collapse on them is a bit like blaming a flood on the people running from the water. Something upstream broke. They were what the break looked like when it reached your coastline. Now, Greece. And Greece gives us something almost unbearable. The last words of a bureaucracy, written on the day it died. On a hilltop in the southwest Peloponnese stood the palace of Pylos, the palace Homer would later call the home of wise old Nestor. It was an administrative machine. Its scribes kept records on clay tablets in a script we call Linear B, and they kept records of everything. Sheep, wheat, olive oil, bronze allocations, textile workers, offerings to the gods, and men assigned to duties. Here is the crucial thing about Linear B, and it will matter enormously in a moment. These tablets were never meant to last. They were unbaked clay, working documents, the ancient equivalent of a whiteboard, wiped and reused as the year turned. They survive for one reason only. The palace burned, and the fire that destroyed the building baked the tablets in it hard as pottery. Every Linear B tablet we possess is a document that was sitting on a desk on the last day. We only have their paperwork because we have their catastrophe. And what was on the desk at Pylos? Among the final tablets are military assignments. They record watchers posted to guard the coast and rowers being urgently allocated to maritime lookout positions. Men by name sent to watch the sea. It is the single most cinematic document to survive from the Bronze Age, and for decades, it has been read exactly the way you're reading it right now, as a kingdom bracing for something coming from the water.
But I have to be straight with you, because this is the bit where popular history usually stops and the actual scholarship doesn't. That reading is contested. Some specialists argue there is nothing in the tablets themselves that says these postings were in anticipation of an invasion, that Coast Guard duties and rower levies may simply have been routine administration that happens to be preserved because of when the fire came. So it may be a kingdom watching for its executioner. It may be a Tuesday immortalized by accident. Both are honest readings, and I'd rather you have the real ambiguity than a better story.
What isn't ambiguous is what happened next. Around 1180 BC, Pylos burned violently. And it wasn't alone. In the decades leading to 1200 BC, the great Mycenaean centers, Mycenae itself, Tiryns, Pylos, went into what can only be described as a defensive panic. Walls thickened, secret stairways cut down to protected water sources, whole populations pulled inside fortifications. Then, one after another, the palaces were looted, torched, and reduced to ash. Not raided and rebuilt, ended.
And then comes the consequence that I think is the most extraordinary single fact in the whole collapse. Linear B was not a literature. It was not used for poetry or letters or religion or philosophy. It was used, as far as we can tell, exclusively for palace accounting, which means the only people who could read and write were the palace accountants and scribes. So when the palaces burned and those men died or scattered, the skill went with them. Writing did not decline in Greece, it vanished completely for something like 400 years.
400 years. To put that in scale, that is the distance between us today and the middle of the 1600s. An entire civilization forgot how to write and stayed forgotten for longer than the United States, Canada, and Australia have existed combined. When the Greeks eventually became literate again, they did it from scratch, borrowing an alphabet from Phoenician traders, a completely different system. Linear B stayed unreadable until 1952, when a young English architect named Michael Ventris finally cracked it, 3,500 years after the last person who could read it died.
What replaced the palaces was not a dark, empty nothing. People don't stop existing, but it was a savage simplification. Greece became a fractured, illiterate society of small, isolated farming villages. Population fell, settlements shrank, long-distance trade thinned to a trickle. Monumental buildings stopped for centuries. The people living in the shadow of Mycenae's walls could see, every single day, ruins they could not have built and could not explain, which is very likely why later Greeks decided the walls had been made by giants. They weren't being fanciful. They genuinely could not imagine humans doing it. There's one more culprit in the room, and it's the one nobody can plan for. In 2001, Eric Klein and the geophysicist Amos Nur published work on something they called an earthquake storm. The idea is this: along a linked fault system, a major earthquake transfers stress down the line, which can trigger another, which transfers stress again, producing a sequence of large quakes across a whole region over decades. Not one bad night, a generation of bad nights walking along a fault. And their dating is uncomfortably neat. They identified a 50-year window, roughly 1225 to 1175 BC, in which the Mediterranean was hit by a rapid-fire series of major earthquakes. That window sits precisely on top of the collapse. Overlay a map of 20th century earthquakes of magnitude 6.5 or greater at high intensity across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean onto a map of late Bronze Age sites destroyed in this period, and virtually every destroyed site falls inside the shaken zones. The scholar Robert Drews compiled a list of 47 sites across the region destroyed during that half-century. 47! Cities, palaces, fortresses, towns, from Greece across Anatolia down through Cyprus and the Levant. And here is the genuinely difficult part, which every honest account has to admit. It is very hard to tell which of those were destroyed by earthquakes, which by invaders, and which by people inside the walls turning on their own rulers. A burnt layer in the ground looks broadly the same whoever lit it.
Which brings us to the framework that actually holds this whole story together, and it belongs to Eric Klein. His argument in his book on this period is that the collapse was a systems collapse, and that phrase has a technical meaning. It describes four things happening together. The central administration collapses, the traditional elite class disappears, the centralized economy fails, and settlements shift while population declines. Not a defeat, a dissolution. The structure itself stops being able to hold its own shape. There's one more suspect, and it's the one that leaves the least evidence: the people inside the walls. When a palace controls the grain and the grain runs out, the palace becomes the most obvious target for anyone who is hungry. Several scholars have argued that at least some of these destructions were internal, revolts, or simply the collapse of any reason to keep obeying an administration that could no longer deliver anything. And archaeologically, that is almost invisible. A palace burned by its own city and a palace burned by a foreign army leave the same black layer in the soil. We may be reading a century of revolutions as a century of invasions. And Klein's key insight is about combination, not sequence. His point, roughly put, is that drought alone might not end a civilization. Famine alone might not. Invaders alone might not. Earthquakes alone might not. Any one of them a functioning state absorbs. That's what states are for. But if 3 or 4 of them arrive in quick succession, you get a perfect storm. And crucially, there is no time to recover between the blows. The state is still on one knee from the last thing when the next thing lands. That's not a mystery, that's arithmetic. So, let's assemble our list of what hit the Eastern Mediterranean in roughly a single lifetime. A drying trend running for over a century. 3 consecutive years of severe drought at the worst possible moment. Famine following the drought, a 50-year sequence of major earthquakes, mass movements of displaced people, armed and desperate, trade routes failing, and with them the tin that the entire technological base depended on, internal unrest as governments failed to feed their own populations. That's 7. Any 2 are survivable? All 7 overlapping are not. And the magnitude of what followed is worth stating plainly, because it's easy to let ancient history feel small. Within a few decades of 1177 BC, those trade routes and most of the trading civilizations on them had collapsed. Historians who work on this period compare the scale of the catastrophe to the fall of the Roman Empire, except that the fall of Rome took centuries and left successor states, laws, language, and a church. This took about 50 years and left in many places silence. One kingdom stayed on its feet. Egypt survived, and the reason is agricultural rather than heroic. Egypt did not depend on rainfall. Egypt depended on the Nile, which is fed by monsoon rains falling a very long way south in the Ethiopian highlands. A drought that emptied the fields of Anatolia and Greece and Syria did not automatically empty the Nile Valley. Add a strong army under Ramses III, and Egypt had the 2 things nobody else had: food and the organized force to protect it. But surviving is not the same as being unharmed, and what happened inside Egypt over the following decades is, to me, the quietest and most convincing evidence that this was a genuine world crisis, and not a regional bad patch. Because we can watch the richest, best defended, most stable state in the Eastern Mediterranean slowly run out of grain, not in a battle, but in its own account books, in the wages of its own workers. Just outside the Valley of the Kings, there was a village called Deir el-Medina. It housed the craftsmen who cut and painted the royal tombs, an elite workforce, skilled, literate, paid directly by the state. They weren't paid in coins because coins didn't exist yet. They were paid in rations: grain, fish, vegetables, oils. And in the 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, around 1158 BC, the rations stopped arriving. So the workers of Deir el-Medina did something that, as far as the surviving record goes, nobody had ever done before. They stopped working, walked off the site, and staged a sit-in. It is the first recorded labor strike in human history. We know about it in detail because a scribe named Amun-Nacht wrote it down, and that document survives today in Turin as the Strike Papyrus. The most powerful state on Earth, and its own tomb builders down tools because the food didn't come. They struck in November. They occupied the necropolis, then moved to the mortuary temple of Thutmose III, then to that of Ramesses II, and stayed, demanding their grain. And what they said has come down to us almost verbatim. Quote, "We are here because of the hunger and thirst. We are not accustomed to not having unguents, fish, and greens. Write to the Pharaoh, our perfect lord, take note of our words, and write to the vizier, our superior, because we are in need of our provisions." End quote. I love that statement, and I want to point out why it's so telling. It is not revolutionary. It is not angry at the Pharaoh. It's almost apologetic. "We are not accustomed to this. Please tell the boss." These are loyal state employees politely explaining that they are hungry. And the reason the rations failed wasn't cruelty. The political and economic difficulties of the late Ramesside period had simply suspended the supply. And that suspension produced a long conflict between the village and the authorities. Even Egypt, the survivor, could not reliably feed the people building the king's tomb. Ramesses III is usually called the last great pharaoh of Egypt, and the title is accurate in a slightly grim way. Great mostly because of who came after. He beat back the Sea Peoples, he kept the state intact, and then he died in a palace conspiracy, and the new kingdom that had produced the wealth of Tutankhamun and the monuments of his namesake began a long slide. Egypt was still Egypt. It was never again the Egypt of the Amarna letters, writing to its brothers as an equal among great powers. Now, let's talk about the metal, because the technology story is the clearest cause and effect chain in the whole collapse, and it is beautifully simple. Bronze needs tin. Tin came from very far away, through the long, delicate chains we traced at the start. When the palaces that organized the trade burned, and the routes became too dangerous, and the merchants who knew the routes were dead or displaced, the tin stopped. And without tin, bronze is not expensive, it is impossible. So people used what was under their feet. Iron ore is common. It is almost everywhere. It is much harder to work, it needs higher temperatures and different skills, which is why the Bronze Age had known about iron for centuries without switching to it. Bronze was simply better, and while the trade worked, easier to get. But when the trade stopped, the difficult local metal beat the excellent imported one because the excellent imported one no longer arrived. That is the entire transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age in one sentence. Not a breakthrough, a substitution. And the world that emerged used iron in a fundamentally different way. Bronze was elite because tin came through royal and palace networks. A palace could control who had metal, which meant a palace could control who had weapons and good tools. Iron was local. Anyone with ore, charcoal, and skill could make it. Historians have pointed out what that does to a society. It democratizes force, and it democratizes farming. The world after the collapse was poorer and smaller, and also, in a strange way, less easy for a palace to dominate. The bare shape of the aftermath is this. Great empires were replaced by small city-states. Monumental construction stopped almost everywhere. Populations declined and settlements moved, often uphill and inland, away from coasts, which tells you something about what people were afraid of. International correspondence ends. The club of great powers dissolves because there are no longer enough great powers to have a club. And in Greece, as we said, literacy itself simply ceases for roughly 4 centuries. What did it actually feel like to live in the after? Smaller, mostly. In the century following the collapse, settlement counts in some regions fall dramatically, and the sites that remain are villages rather than towns. Diets narrow. Pottery gets simpler and more local. You can literally watch the imports disappear from the ground layer by layer. Houses get smaller and are built with less skill because the specialists who knew how are gone, and there is no palace commissioning anything. It is not an apocalypse of fire and screaming. It is 3 or 4 generations of things quietly getting a bit worse and a bit more local until nobody remembers otherwise. I want to sit in that silence for a moment because it's the emotional center of this whole story and it's easy to skate over. Imagine a world where the last person who could read dies. Not a library burning, that's dramatic and libraries get rebuilt.
Just an old man in a village who, when he was young, worked in a palace and learned to press signs into clay, and who is now the only one left who knows what the signs mean, and who has nobody to teach because the palace is a ruin and nobody needs accounts kept anymore. And then he dies, and it's gone. And the people who came after knew something had been lost, even if they couldn't say what. They lived among walls they could not have built. They told stories about a golden age when heroes had bronze armor and great kings sailed to Troy, stories that got passed down orally for 400 years before anyone could write them down again. When Homer finally appears, he is describing a world he never saw, from memories that had been handed mouth to mouth across the silence. The Iliad is, among other things, a rumor about this collapse, arriving 4 centuries late. But things did grow back, and it's worth ending with who and how, because collapse is never the end of the sentence. 2 groups came out of this stronger, and it's instructive that they were opposites. The first, Assyria. Its capital, Ashur, was largely unaffected by the worst of it. Inland, on the Tigris, insulated from the Mediterranean cascade. Assyria was the most notable survivor in Mesopotamia, and over the following centuries, it became the greatest power the region had ever seen. And Assyria drew a very particular lesson from the Age of Collapse. The Assyrian Empire became the first power in world history to systematically conquer almost all of its neighbors, using a large, permanent standing army. Not brotherhood, not gift exchange, not letters beginning "my brother," direct, permanent, professional control. Having lived through a century in which relationships proved worthless when the food ran out, the next great empire was built on the opposite principle entirely. The second group went the other way. Along the Levantine coast, the cities of Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon adapted fast to the new reality. We call them the Phoenicians. They did not build a strong unified state. They barely built a state at all, remaining a loose set of trading cities. What they did was restart long-distance trade, and they did it without any of the palace machinery that had made the old system work. And it's from these merchants that the Greeks eventually borrowed the alphabet that ended their 400 years of silence. And there is one last document I want to give you because it is the perfect closing image for this entire hour. Around 1090 to 1075 BC, about a century after the worst of the collapse, an Egyptian official named Wenamon was sent to Byblos to buy cedar wood for a new sacred bark of the god Amun. He was sent not by a pharaoh, but by Herihor, the high priest of Amun, who was by then the effective ruler of Upper Egypt. That detail alone tells you what had happened to Egypt. The journey goes badly from the start. While docked on the Levantine coast, Wenamon is robbed by one of the sailors. He arrives at Byblos with no money and no leverage, and the local king, Zakarbal, keeps him waiting. And when he finally gets his audience and asks for the cedar, Zakarbal refuses to hand it over as a gift in the traditional way, the way it had always been done for Egypt. He demands payment. Wenamon has to send back to Egypt for money like an ordinary trader. 200 years earlier, an Egyptian envoy arriving on that coast would have been received as the voice of a superpower. Cedar would have moved because Egypt asked. That was the deal, and the deal was the world. Wenamon's humiliation, being robbed, being made to wait, being asked to pay, it's not a story about one unlucky man. It is the sound of a system that no longer exists. The brotherhood was over. The letters had stopped. Nobody was anyone's brother anymore. And the cedar cost money. So what do we take from it at the end of a very long night? Not, I think, a warning. I'm not going to do that to you at this hour. Something gentler. The late Bronze Age was not destroyed by a villain. There is no single enemy in this story you can point at. It was undone by a drying sky, by 3 bad years arriving at the worst possible moment, by the ground shaking, by hungry people moving, and above all, by the fact that everything was connected to everything else, so that when one part failed, the failure had somewhere to travel.
And yet, cities were rebuilt somewhere else. The alphabet came back, simpler and better and available to everyone rather than to palace accountants. Iron replaced bronze and put tools in far more hands. People kept farming, kept trading, kept telling stories about heroes until somebody could write them down again. The world that came out of the silence was in some ways more durable than the brilliant, fragile one that went into it. Nothing was preserved. Everything continued.
That's where we'll leave them. The scribes, the sailors, the tin merchants, the watchmen on the coast at Pylos, the workers at Deir el-Medina politely explaining that they were hungry. The two officials writing to each other about 20 ships. They didn't know they were living at the end of something. Nobody ever does. They were just getting through the week. So let your shoulders drop and let the letters and the ships and the burning palaces drift somewhere far off and long ago. It was all a very long time ago. It is all completely quiet now. Sleep well.